Alrighty, welcome back. In this video, we are going to start implementing the due date functionality. So let's get started with what you can see here. So when we click on it, we can select date, and then we can see that the date is there. And once we update, the date will also be put into the database. All right, so let's get started. Therefore, first of all, we should go to our card model, because now we also want to store the date about or the due date here as well. So let's add a new entry, which will be val due date, which will be a long that I'm going to assign 0 to. Okay, so I'm going to store the date as a long value because it's easier that way. You just get a long value and then you can transfer that back into a readable date, so to speak. All right, if you do that, we of course need to add a line here as well where we say source dot read long, and that will allow us to read the due date. And then also we need to write it. So here, write long with the due date. Okay, then we can go to the card details activity, and here I will create a new global variable which will store the date. So private var m selected due date milliseconds will be a long. So I'm going to store it in milliseconds, so this will be a huge value, but that's why we use long here. But we don't really need to take care of that too much. We'll just transfer it or convert it accordingly. Next, we will need a date picker. And I'm going to create a new function down here to display or show the date picker. And by the way, you can just simply use the date picker functionality that we have used in an earlier project. All right, let me show you what the date picker will look like. So we need a calendar instance first. So I'm going to call this one C. Then I get the year from the calendar. So calendar year, the month with calendar.month, and day with day of month. And then we can create a date picker dialog, which will have an on date set listener, so that will wait for us to set the date. And when you set the date, you will get a view, the year, month of year, and day of month. And we then use the information to store the day of month. If day of month is less than 10, we say 0 day of month. And otherwise, we just use the day of month because we don't want to display 1, 2, 3, 4 or something like that. We want to display the date with 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3, and so forth. All right, then we get the month of the year, and there we do the same thing. All right, and then we get the select date. And here, by the way, if you were wondering what the code looks like here, then we get the selected date, which is day of month, day of year, and year. So basically those things that we prepared here, which were just another way of preparing the or displaying the data, and then we just use that as the selected date, and that will be a string, of course. Then we set that to be the TV select due date text. So in the activity card details, we have this text view called TV select due date, and that's the one here. This one will then be populated with the selected date. Okay, and that happens when the date set listener is called, right? So once we set the date. And then we need a simple date formatter in order to format it. We use the SDF. Then we create a date based on the SDF.parse. So we parse our string into a date. And then we can set that date to be the one for our selected due date in milliseconds, because time will return a long value, which is the number of milliseconds since the 1st of January 1970 at 0 o'clock, 0 minutes, 0 seconds. All right. And then we pass in the year, the month, and the day. All right, so this is what the date picker dialog will do, all of the code up to here, and then we say, okay, let's show the date picker dialog. Okay, so that's what this show date picker function does. It's nothing new. We have seen that before. We have used it before. This was just a quick refresher. All right, and when do we want to display this date picker, or when do we want to call this function here? Well, once we click on the text view. Okay, so let's go all the way up to our onCreate function here. And in there, I'm going to add an onClick listener for our text view underscore select due date, this one here. And let's set an onClick listener here, which will then call the show date picker function. Okay, so it's this element right here, select due date. Once we click on it, we want this date picker to appear. And of course, in our cart details activity, we have this function called update cart details, this one here. And there, currently, we are creating a cart, but we are not passing the date as well. So that's what we need to add here as well. And that will be our mSelected due date milliseconds. Okay, so now our cart will get this additional information because if you look at the cart, that's what we added this due date for. And then of course, we want to display the due date if it was already set before. So if it is in the database, we want to set the due date. Okay, and that should be done in our onCreate method. So I'm just going to put that up here, where I'm just going to say mSelected due date milliseconds should be mBoard details dot task list at the mTask list position at the cart position and dot due date. Okay, so pretty long statement here. You see they don't get shorter. Luckily we don't have any objects underneath carts that would make it even longer. But all right, that's the due date in milliseconds. And then what we can check is if the value is not null, or 0 better said. So in this case it's actually the 0. So mSelected due date in milliseconds. If it's greater than 0, we know that there was a value in the database. Okay, if it's 0, then it's the default value for the card, so there was no due date set ever. Okay, it's just going to be 0 here. All right, but if it was greater than 0, we know that there was a value set, and then we want to display this value as the text. So here, we want to, first of all, get a simple date format object, which will be simple date format with a specific pattern that we want to use, and I'm just going to use this pattern here: day, day, month, month, year, year, year. Of course, you have different patterns that you can use if you want. I'm going to use the locale English. So here it's with a capital L, locale dot English. And then I can use this simple date format in order to format my mSelected due date in milliseconds to a readable format. So to a format that fits this pattern. Okay, so selected date will be our simple date format dot format. So we use that simple date format object that we just created to format our variable mSelected due date in milliseconds. But of course, we need to make a date out of it. So let's create a date object from it, just like that. And then that will now give us the date in a readable format that we can then use to use it for our selected due date dot text is equal to selected date. Okay, so this code here will take care of assigning the date to this text field if it was in the database before. So if we had stored the due date beforehand. All right, then at that point, we should be able to test this and see if it actually works. Okay, so there we are. Let's check out our board with image. Let's go to our card 1. Let's select the due date. Okay, so the dialog opens up. This is very good. That's great. So let's select the date here. Due date is the 11th of March. Let's update it. All right, great. We are back in our card here, or the card lists, and here you can see when we get back to the card, the date is in fact gathered here. So we can in fact see the date here. Now let's check out our boards here to see if the date is in fact there. So we have the card and we can see the due date is there. So it's this value here, and you can use the long to date online converter, epoch converter, in order to calculate it. So timestamp to human date, and we can see it's Wednesday 11th. All right, so that seems to work. That's awesome. So let's go over to the next video where we can then drag and drop cards. So see you in the next one.